with the aid of vaccines that are efficacious. However, at the same time, we recognize that we have been put in a position of extreme economic uncertainty. The current recession that we are part of is not unique to St. Kitts and Nevis, but is prevalent the world over. And at the same time, we are cognizant of the fact that it is quite possible that the effects of the pandemic will be with us well into 2022. As a result of that, I consider it prudent in the manner in which the budget has been crafted, in the face of all of these variables, that we move in a cautiously optimistic manner, while at the same time recognizing the need for austerity, the need to be realistic, and the need to be conservative in the projections that we have put forward to this Honorable House. And it is because of that why I could not subscribe to the articulations coming from the member for number 6 in terms of what I could consider to be not only unfair, but adverse commentary when none of us are clairvoyant. And under the situation that we are now in, we are trying our best to wrap our arms around something whose characteristics we are still very much uncertain about. So in light of all of these things, that is why I give commendations to the Ministry of Finance, to the FinSec and her team, because it could not have been easy. And in a normal year, the budgeting process is very tedious. There are many times the Ministry of Finance staff will be there until midnight. And then you add a COVID environment on top of that, and they probably took up residence there for several evenings to get us to where we are now. The people of St. Kitts and Nevis, Mr. Speaker, should also consider ourselves very fortunate that to date we have weathered the storm of the socio-economic uncertainty fairly well as it relates to COVID. And I say this in the context of observing the plight of other CARICOM member states, such as St. Lucia this past June, where it was difficult for the government to pay wages and salaries to civil servants. I say this in light of the fact that several weeks ago, the government of Antigua themselves would have had challenges in terms of non-payment of pensions to retirees in Antigua. And I say this in light of the fact that if we look further afield to the west and we consider Jamaica, we recognize that COVID is rampant in that territory, and at the same time, the country is also facing a dengue outbreak. So these two things together do not make for a happy domestic situation. So for those reasons and for others, I think we should consider ourselves very grateful. We should also express gratitude to the public health infrastructure, the leadership of that infrastructure, that has gotten us to this point thus far in terms of containment of the possible impact that COVID could have created. In particular, I point to the yeoman service being provided by the COVID-19 task force, the medical experts who continue to advise the government on the way forward, the security forces and other frontline workers who have been in the vanguard of leading the charge in terms of our response to the pandemic. It would be remiss of me if I did not single out the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hazel Laws, Head of the HEOC and Deputy Chair of the Task Force, for her leadership in this regard. I also thank sincerely the National Disaster Coordinator and Chairman of the COVID-19 Task Force, Mr. Abdiel Samuel, for his yeoman service to the entire process, and also Dr. Cameron Wilkinson, the Medical Chief of Staff of JNF General Hospital. The other person it is important for me to extend thanks to is the co-chair of the Disaster Mitigation Council, the Honorable Attorney General. Even though it is not something we would complain about, I can safely tell you, and I am sure the Attorney General would agree, that the decision to take up the offer of appointment by the Prime Minister to head the COVID task force for oversight purposes and at the same time to co-chair the Disaster Mitigation Council has been nothing short of having a second job on top of the ministries that we run. But we have done so out of love of country and out of national service. So, Attorney General, I do sincerely thank you for your leadership in this regard. Mr. Speaker, particularly now when we have opened our borders, it is important for us then to protect the health and wellness of our people and to protect the gains that we have made over the past 9 months. We must continue with the strict adherence to the COVID-19 protocols. We must also be very vigilant and consistent when it comes to the non-pharmaceutical measures that we have heard ad nauseum. Wear your mask, practice social and physical distancing, practice proper hand hygiene, avoid mass gatherings. These are things that are still important because until when there is a vaccine that is reliable, these are all the measures that we have available to us. We must all come on board. We have heard the expression time and again, from the task force to the Prime Minister to the man on the street to the persons who call into the radio programs. An all-of-society approach is necessary for us to extricate our way out of this pandemic. And we need to echo it repeatedly. The Prime Minister in his own budget address on Tuesday would have echoed similar sentiments. And we have to take these sentiments on board and they have to become part of our new normal. We have been blessed in St. Kitts and Nevis with only having 28 cases, 4 of them still not recovered, but none of them having any serious illnesses, and no persons would have died. That has not been the experience of a lot of our other CARICOM member states, even our nearby neighbor Antigua. The dynamic that we are also seeing as a shift now is that even the healthcare workers in the CARICOM basin are now suffering from COVID. And we cannot afford to lose that support system in terms of the COVID-19 infrastructure. Just 2 days ago, I would have read a news article where 2 twin brothers out of Belize would have died from COVID while serving in hospitals in Belize 24 hours apart from each other. The last death due to COVID in Antigua was a government worker in the hospital system. So this sends a message to us about the need to ensure that when we wear a mask, we do it for ourselves, but we do it for other people. And that when we inundate the healthcare infrastructure by laxity when it comes to COVID, it also impacts on the ability for us to be cared for by the medical professionals if they themselves are also vulnerable and exposed and overburdened, if illness goes on to the point where short staffing becomes the order of the day, as we would have seen in major first world countries like New York, the UK, Germany, etc. Our people need not take for granted the blessings that we've had throughout 2020. And one of the other blessings I think we should not take for granted is the fact that God, in his wisdom and mercy, did not choose to compound our problems by exposing us to any severe impact from cyclonic storms as a result of the recently ended hurricane season, the Atlantic hurricane season. As I get now into the meat of the matter as it relates to the ministries for which I am responsible, I would wish to start with the Ministry of International Trade, Commerce and Consumer Affairs, and to indicate that for 2021, the recurrent expenditure being projected for that ministry is $4,673,747, with a capital expenditure projected at $670,000, for a total allocation of $5,343,747, or 7.1% increase over the allocation that would have been approved in this House for 2020. In terms of the subjects under this ministry, they are regional and international trade organizations, World Trade Organization, the European Union, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, CARICOM matters, commerce and domestic trade, industries, including the industrial estates, the micro, small, and medium enterprise sector under the aegis of the Small Business Development Center within the ministry. And as a point of information, the SBDC has recently replaced what we previously knew as NED, the National Entrepreneurial Development Division within the Ministry of International Trade. The subjects also include import and export control vendors, e-commerce, price control, consumer affairs, the multi-purpose laboratory, and the Bureau of Standards. Before I go further, I think it will be useful if I was in a position to just share briefly the current environment and the work program of these particular areas. But before I do so, I would want to spend a little bit of time putting in context my take on what the current business environment is like, the environment in which we all must operate, and an environment to which the Ministry of International Trade is obligated to respond in order to look after the needs of the stakeholders in the private sector as well as the public sector. Based on recent data from Inland Revenue, we are seeing that on the books there are some 5,013 registered businesses. Of that number, some 160 are registered as manufacturing, and I would have to dare say that the bulk of them would have to be micro producers. 4,303 are invested in the services sectors, and the remaining 550 are documented as operators in the general business and trading sector. The manufacturing sector has proven through the COVID experience to be a resilient sector, much more so than tourism. The enclave or foreign-owned manufacturing sector would have opened up as early as April, once it became apparent that a number of the manufacturing facilities were critical to the fight against COVID-19. Case in point, the unexpected request from the Trump administration to have the American-owned plant API Harrow Server Controls reopen in order to manufacture components that are used in the production of ventilators. We would have also seen a short uptick in terms of production at Cajola Cristado, especially during lockdown periods in the US. That company is in the business of manufacturing traps for the cable TV industry, and with more people being at home and on lockdown, of course, the need and the demand went through the roof in terms of people who wanted new connections for cable and internet in their homes so that they could communicate with the rest of the world. So as a result of that, we would have seen an increase in terms of the need for parts for the traps and the traps themselves as it relates to what Cajola is in the habit of producing for the telecom sector. As a result of the work that would have been done by API Harrow, just on November 26th, I would have been present at a meeting for the Manufacturers Division of the Chamber, where API Harrow was recognized as Manufacturer of the Year in light of COVID and in light of the pivotal role that they would have played in terms of production in tiny little St. Kitts and Nevis to help turn around the bad fortunes of the health sector in the US in order to get ventilators produced in mass numbers. Presently, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the manufacturing sector, there are some 1,112 workers who have returned to work, with another 156 who remain on furlough, representing 14% of the manufacturing workforce. And this is the reason why I said that the resilience of the sector has proven its place. Before I come off of manufacturing, I should also indicate that our own indigenous manufacturers have fared fairly well. Case in point, Carrie Brewery. In his remarks yesterday, the Minister of Tourism, with responsibility for transport, for number 4, would have indicated that there would be an increase in terms of export business from which SCASPA can generate revenue by virtue of the containers that would be required for processing, for excise, based on the brewery's increase in production for exports. In spite of the pandemic, as of the end of November, the factory was able to pass the 1 million case milestone when it comes to production of their beverages. At the same time, the current production now stands at just over 1 million, and although local sales are down, they are compensating for the uptick in terms of export sales. The 2021 production target is 1.4 million cases, and in order to do this, the factory has already determined that they will have to operate on 3 shifts in order to meet the export demands. Employment as a result of that will be increased from 121 workers to 154 in order to power the continuous 24-hour operation at Carrie Brewery. And of course, when that would have been realized, it would be noted that there would have been a 35% increase in production at Carib Brewery as a result of the additional 750,000 cases of beverage that should be exported. So this is good news for the local manufacturing sector, because it is showing us that in spite of what the global statistics are telling us in terms of global trade and what is happening even in the G7 or the G20 countries, as small as St. Kitts and Nevis happens to be, we are still able to remain buoyant in certain sectors, with manufacturing certainly being one of them. The other observation I have noted, and I hinted to earlier, is that COVID-19 would have demonstrated the fickle nature of the tourism industry. Through no fault of tourism. Tourism in and of itself is a fickle sector, because what you're in fact selling is an experience. You're selling promises of the vacation of a lifetime, but in fact what you're doing is selling an experience. And in the face of COVID, with airline traffic grinding to a halt, on which that sector relies, obviously there would have been negative implications. Tourism, under normal circumstances, would be a leading contributor to GDP, accounting on its own without the addition of the allied sectors for some 8% of GDP. But when the others are added, we start climbing higher in terms of the GDP going into the region of about 60% when all of the other services that are fringe activities are added onto it. Yes, at present we have all of the branded hotels open for staycations, and at the same time there are government-approved quarantine facilities primarily for our nationals. As of the time of the sit-in, we have two major carriers that would have returned with regularity, being British Airways and also American Airlines, with smaller charter services still being operated with the other territories in the region. And of course, a number of them are assisting in our own airlift by working out of feeder airports in Antigua, Puerto Rico, Barbados, and so forth. And it is certainly true, as the Minister of Tourism would have indicated, that it would take at least another 12 months before we begin to see a significant turnaround. Because, of course, the aircrafts are coming in, but with reduced passenger loads. So that is something that will take a while to work itself out, at the same time that the cruise industry is trying to climb its way out of the recession as well. What we are also seeing, Mr. Speaker, is that there has been an uptick in terms of the number of business registrations taking place in spite of COVID. And what we are realizing is that there is a cadre of emerging entrepreneurs that are mainly young people who are recognizing what is happening and at the same time have the intestinal fortitude to try their hand at business. And when you think about business, we have to be mindful of the fact that an entrepreneur, by any other term, is still a risk taker. It's a risk you take to get into business, to feed yourselves, to support yourselves, when no one is there waiting to pay your salary so that you can pay your bills. And then you trust that the risks that you take are calculated enough that you can then create employment for other people, which then eases the burden off of the public sector to become the main employer of the people of any country. And that is nothing to sneeze at. And to give you an example of what that uptick has been like, Mr. Speaker, the SBDC in 2020 would have recorded that they would have assisted some 73 startup businesses to access business support services at the ministry, in addition to being able to access the tax waivers for which they're eligible under the Small Business Development Act of 2009. Another 103 existing businesses, which means that they're not new startups, would have approached the ministry for assistance along similar lines. And then 61 enterprises were also assisted, apart from that, in the creation of their business plans. Now, in a COVID environment, I think that is a tremendous response in terms of our young people wanting to try their hand at business. And it is something that the Ministry of International Trade is committed to continue providing as a support infrastructure to assist that sector, the MSME sector. In light of the socioeconomic shifts that we have seen in the Federation over the past 9 months due to COVID, it is then therefore important that the government remains focused on steadily and cautiously leading the climb out of the pandemic mode through a careful process of economic restructuring that is responsive to the needs of one, our people, 2, stakeholders in the local business and investment landscape. 3, our partners within the multilateral trading system, because we are not isolated on our own. 4, sub-regional and regional member states' commitments to the OECS Economic Union and the CARICOM Single Market and Economy. 5, to our essential service providers to ensure that our jurisdiction is competitive and that the standard and quality of life in our country are never compromised. And to achieve this, the ministry and basically every ministry and every department in government is being called upon as a result of COVID to recalibrate its role and its mandate in order to respond to the demands that this new coexistence with COVID-19 is going to call on us to do. As I commence my discourse on the Ministry of International Trade, I just wanted to spend a few minutes to put in context what has been the sum total of the various departments within that ministry and efforts that will be put in place come 2021 in terms of the continuation of the ministry's work program. So if I may, I will start with international trade. And that is to say that that department is focused on international trade facilitation between the Federation and the global trading jurisdictions, either through bilateral arrangements or multilateral trading arrangements. And as I said this, what comes to mind would be the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, the OECS Economic Union, the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade, GATT, succeeded by the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the soon-to-be implemented Economic Partnership Agreement, the EPA, between the CARIFORUM states and the European Union. Now, we would have heard many things about the EPA with the CARIFORUM and EU member states for years on end now. And very soon, all of these things will come into play, because I think the kick-in period for the EPA is 2025. So we really do not have a lot of time in terms of the existing Cotonou arrangement that we are still operating under, or post-Cotonou rather. At the same time, CARIFORUM is also concluding negotiations with the UK to have a separate economic partnership agreement in light of the fact that Brexit is almost upon us. Come 31st of December, that will be a done deal. And I should report to this House that by December 11th, which is last Friday, St. Kitts and Nevis and 4 other CARIFORUM states would have signed a non-binding MOU with the UK to conclude arrangements for the UK CARIFORUM EPA by the 31st of January. The MOU, as I indicated, is non-binding, but it gives us an opportunity to fine-tune some of our other arrangements with the UK, among them, of course, being whether or not there will be any negative fallout for us in terms of losses of revenue for duty waivers, etc. But of course, what is important to us is reciprocity. In other words, the same way British goods are allowed to come in here, we would want to make sure that our own manufactured goods and services from service providers can access the UK market with the same amount of ease. I would also, at this point, give this Honourable House a short update on the partial scope agreement, which has been under negotiation between St. Kitts and Nevis, Brazil, and Guyana since 2005. To be honest, it was private sector-led, and credit must be given to Mr. Jose Rosa of Cajola Cristado for advancing it as far as it has gotten. St. Kitts and Nevis would have done everything that was required of us by the Brazilian government in terms of the trade negotiations on the acceptable product list. We had originally some 33 items to trade with Brazil from mainly our manufacturing enclave sector. And then that list would have been whittled down to 11 products because of pushback from Brazilian manufacturers who wanted to protect their own manufactured goods. And then, strangely enough, after more than 2 years of waiting and not hearing anything from the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, on December 4th, the Ministry of Trade would have received an email basically expressing interest on the part of the Brazilian government to pick up where we would have left off with the PSA with Brazil. So very early in the new year, we would be taking up that matter because, again, it provides us with access to South America's largest market, which is Brazil, in terms of a place to export our goods and services, and at the same time to be able to have, in a more structured manner, access into our market for Brazilian products. We already have Brazilian products here in terms of corned beef, poultry products, pork products, etc., and other perishable items, other canned goods, and some amount of plastics in terms of containers and so forth, which you would see in the supermarkets from time to time. So we would wish to pursue that, and I should at the same time indicate that there are opportunities for new businesses to come out of this new trading arrangement with Brazil. Why do I say that? For example, on the list that Brazil produced, there are things called hinnies. I never knew what a hinny was, so I had to go and look it up. And the hinny happens to be the cross between a donkey and a horse. I thought that was a mule. But apparently it depends on which gender the horse or the mule or the donkey was for you to determine what is a hinny. Nevertheless, hinny meat apparently is being used in the pet food industry. So if we can import that type of meat from Brazil, then it tells us that St. Kitts and Nevis has another business opportunity in front of us where some enterprising person can probably start a pet food business right here once those goods take national treatment on by passing through Guyana, which will then give them CARICOM treatment. And then you have your primary raw materials to set up a pet food industry right here in St. Kitts and Nevis. So the opportunities are there, but it's for creativity to be employed to see what is possible between St. Kitts, Guyana, and Brazil in terms of the PSA. The other department I wish to look at is Industry and Commerce. And this department focuses on facilitating and assisting the creation of a favorable environment in which the industrial and commercial development sector would need to grow and to thrive, particularly the manufacturing sector. The division also supports the local business and trading sector, and the Small Business Center, again, is the one that is the focal point in the ministry to provide support to trade and to industrial and commercial activity in the Federation. I would have already explained that the SBDC has replaced NED, and the focus of that is to provide support to the micro, small, and medium enterprise sector, the MSME sector. That division, the SBDC, works very closely with what is still called CEDU in Nevis. I think that is still vested in the Development Bank. And in St. Kitts, for those of you with long enough memories, you would recall that before there was NED, there was a sister agency in the Development Bank here referred to as CEDU. But that has since graduated into two more iterations, and we are now at the point of the SBDC based on the partnership arrangement that had been struck with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce some time ago and the U.S. Department of Trade. Now, one of the key deliverables for the SBDC in 2020 and 2021 would be the amendments that would be required to the Small Business Development Act. And if I may just indicate that that Small Business Development Act came around in 2009 after about 2 years of lobbying and stakeholder consultations being led by the private sector and financed by the International Labour Organization. The author of the act that we now have is the current Governor General, who at the time would have been a legal counsel to the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. And the act would have provided for businesses to be able to access fiscal incentives in order to give a jump start to the SME sector, especially in light of the recent closure back then of the sugar industry. So the SBDC, by and large, operates under the aegis of the provisions relative to the Small Business Development Act. But what we are noticing is that as a result of the uptick in new business registrations and new requests to access fiscal incentives via the Act, we recognize that there are certain areas in which the Act is now proven deficient. For example, there are 9 possible areas that an individual can get assistance under the Act, and none of them includes food and beverage sectors or operators. And the rationale at the time is that because we would have had a hotel aids ordinance back in 2009, which took care of the hotel and restaurant sector, and we would have had a manufacturing ordinance that would have gone back to 1973, 1974, when firms like Electrofab and also Sun Island closed, would have started operation here in St. Kitts and Nevis. But what we're now realizing is that based on the new types of requests that we're seeing in terms of car rental agencies, food and beverage outlets, and we're also seeing some entrance in terms of the ICT sector, we have to make room for those under the amendments for the Small Business Development Act. In 2021, a major commitment is that of improving the competitiveness of St. Kitts and Nevis as it relates to the doing business ranking of the World Bank. Now, may I say at this juncture that while I have personally, and while this government, I have discovered, would have had reservations over time in terms of the way in which the data has been collected for the indices comprising the study, it still tells us that there's a lot of room left for improvement. For example, St. Kitts and Nevis needs to be doing better when it comes to the amount of time it takes to wind up a business, if bankruptcy is a matter, or if business closure is a chosen path by the entrepreneur or partners in the business. The amount of time it takes to set up a business also needs to be improved. What I have noticed as an absence in the last draft doing business ranking, however, is the fact that all of the work that we would have done in terms of the land registry, for which I give the Attorney General heaps of credit in terms of the cadastral survey that had been put in place, etc., none of that is reflected in the doing business study. And that obviously has been a factor in terms of the rating that we would have received. At the same time, I would also indicate that as a result of the most recent reporting coming out of the World Bank on the doing business rating, the report for 2021 is in a state of flux, largely because jurisdictions such as India would have mysteriously jumped 30 places, and when the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, would have asked the World Bank to indicate how this happened, and they couldn't answer, and the kickback from that is that because of the jump by some 30 places on the indices, India is no longer eligible to receive access to concessionary loan funding. So they have become a victim of the increased ranking for which the World Bank cannot explain. And as a result of that, the focal point in the World Bank has offered to resign because obviously there are discrepancies in terms of how the data is collected and how the data is analyzed. Nevertheless, as I indicated, the Ministry of Trade in 2021 will be focused on improving that rating. We were recently advised that Compete Caribbean would be doing some work to support that project in 2021. We look forward to that because if my memory is correct, going back to 2013, 2014, the same Compete Caribbean as a partner for the CSME, etc., would have started a similar project where the focal point in St. Kitts and Nevis would have been the central bank, and then the project basically fell flat on its face. So we're looking forward to a turnaround in that regard. Now, in terms of the other work that we are planning to do under the SBDC and Industry and Commerce is the setup in 2021 of a pilot business incubator for which space has already been assigned by the Development Bank on the industrial site. And what does this incubator do? The incubator is not a new concept. To be precise, the incubator concept would have been a viable option when our honorable mover of the bill would have been Minister of International Trade many years ago. And at that time, if I recall, the government of Mexico, through the University of Hidalgo, would have offered technical assistance to St. Kitts and Nevis to set up that pilot. And what does that do? The business incubator, in a sense, is a place where small entrepreneurs who cannot afford to have a place of their own can share space in common, share services in common, whether it's meeting room space, secretarial support, admin support. They pay a concessionary figure in terms of rent to cover the utilities, etc., and security. They get all of the support systems that they would require in terms of business facilitation, hand-holding, and they're allowed to stay in that place for up to about 18 months until the business gets big enough that you can move out and then make room for another set of entrepreneurs to come in. So that is something that we're looking forward to very much in the new year, to make that a reality finally. I would also wish to note, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the commitment to the build-out of the MSME sector, that in light of the creation of the new Ministry of Entrepreneurship and Talent Development, we would have had discussions with the Minister to work out an arrangement by which our ministry can be of service to those creative sector operators for whom that ministry has been designed to support. And as a result of that, a desk officer within the Ministry of Trade has already been identified as the focal point to assist those types of creative actors, artists, etc., who may require business support services. So that is already in place so that there be no confusion that the Ministry of Entrepreneurship and Talent Development is intended to duplicate the efforts already articulated by instrument for the Ministry of International Trade. If I may move on to the Bureau of Standards. The Bureau of Standards and Multipurpose Laboratory functions as the local arm of the Caribbean Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, or CROSQ, which is based in Barbados. The Bureau also focuses on the business of maintaining international standards, testing and certification as it relates to production, water quality, air quality, environmental standards, food and beverage safety, and the list goes on. Yesterday, when the Minister of Agriculture would have spoken and he referred to the issues up at the fisheries as it relates to fish poisoning, it would have been the Bureau of Standards who would have had to take the samples and get them sent to a lab in New Jersey to make the final determination in terms of the presence of lead, mercury, and cadmium that would have been found in that particular shipment of fish, which was not native to our waters. So that gives you an idea of what the Bureau does. The Bureau is part of a larger scale project that started already in 2020 under the 11th European Development Fund in terms of rebuilding and restructuring all of the labs at the Bureau located at Lagreed. And the intention is at the first outset to basically set up a metrology mass laboratory. And later on would come a trade laboratory, which will then provide support to manufacturers in the food and beverage sector so that you can get your products tested properly with the nutritional facts, etc., working very closely with the Ministry of Health in terms of all of the work that we would want to see done as it relates to labeling and content in terms of sugars, fats, salts, etc. So that is a project that is coming on stream shortly, and it is coming to the point that when we would have completed that, we would then get international accreditation for the laboratory at Lagreed to be able to meet international standards. In 2021, by extension, we will be working with several firms in St. Kitts and Nevis in terms of their ISO certification, and I think one of the first that will be part of that process for ISO 9001 is Carib Brewery. Now, I said this to say that this is not the first time that a firm in St. Kitts and Nevis would have qualified for ISO standards. Cajola Cristada achieved that on their own about 2012, 2011, at great cost to them. ISO certification and standards don't come cheap. Just a basic application to be considered ISO compliant could cost a company about $100,000. And then it costs almost that every time you have to be recertified so you can maintain your standard and have a certain level of competitive advantage when it comes to your production quality. Also in 2021 would be upgrading of the lab in terms of HACCP certification. And HACCP again is related to the food and beverage sector, which is essentially focusing on the hazard analysis critical control points during the production phase. So for example, if you end up with a bad set of lettuce, you should be able to figure out where along the production continuum did this happen, so that you can zero in on it. Time and again, we would notice here in St. Kitts and Nevis that we get advisories about E. coli and other foreign agents and bacteria that might come in food imports. And that type of matter can be dealt with easily here as well by the lab once they have met the international standards. In terms of CARICOM Affairs and the CSME unit, I would like to add here that that unit, as obviously is indicated, is focused on the operationalization of the CARICOM single market and economy insofar as the revised Treaty of Chabra-Ramos is concerned. By extension, the CSME unit within the ministry focuses on the processing of skill certificates to facilitate the free movement of skilled personnel throughout the member state. In St. Kitts and Nevis, between the period 2005 and 2020, we would have realized that the CSME unit would have processed some 515 skill certificates, with citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis and Jamaica constituting the largest groups at 144 and 141 respectively. Some 348 of the 515 certificate holders are university graduates, and between 2008 and 2020, the unit would have verified 315 skill certificates, of which 119 were for citizens of Jamaica. And while I'm on that score, I should indicate that that matter has proven to be problematic for us, in a manner of speaking, in that between September 2016 and August of 2020, we would have discovered some 11 fraudulent CARICOM still certificates coming into St. Kitts by persons wanting to operate in the Federation through employment. And regrettably, every single one of them were of Jamaican origin. We have, however, been successful in getting the Jamaican government, through the support of the Attorney General's chambers, to put in additional features in their skill certificates so that you cut down on the ability to have fraud and so forth, and basically to put the project back on keel so that it does not lose its integrity. So the Jamaican government has committed itself to ensuring that the new security features are maintained in every single skill certificate that they issue. Because in this day and age where you have all types of software that you can create virtually anything using desktop publishing, Snagit software, whatever it is quite possible to replicate something like that. And if you're not looking closely, you would recognize that you definitely were taken in by what is otherwise a fraudulent document. While I'm on the matter to do with CARICOM, I would also give a brief update on the matter of the Belize case against St. Kitts and Nevis. I think it was in Parliament in September, I would have reported to the House that Belize had brought a case against St. Kitts and Nevis and Trinidad and Tobago in terms of the importation of brown sugar. We were being accused of not applying the common external tariff that would apply to non-CARICOM produced sugar at the rate of 40%. The matter was investigated, and it was discovered that in 2014, a decision had been taken by this government to do away with the 40% CET, so the sugar had been allowed to come into the Federation through reasons unknown to this particular administration. And as a result of that, the 40% had not been paid. It seemed to have coincided with the closure of the supply office in St. Kitts and Nevis, which was a requirement of the WTO because government no longer needed to be in the business of procurement when it came to staple foods such as flour, milk, rice, sugar, etc. So it appears that it might have been a knock-on effect and decision that was taken then. To cut a long story short, essentially, the Ministry of Legal Affairs and Justice would have had to intervene on behalf of the jurisdiction. So we have now written to the government of Belize to take the matter out of the CCJ and end it amicably. As of about a week and a half ago, the Customs and Excise Department did reapply the 40% CET to all imports of sugar that come from non-CARICOM sources, so that matter has been addressed. I think the most recent communication from the AG's chambers would have been just 48 hours ago in terms of agreeing to a set of terms of reference as to how we will move forward in terms of having a monitoring mechanism in place to ensure that that doesn't happen going forward. I should also indicate that St. Kitts and Nevis did not join with Trinidad and Tobago to file a joint response. So the government of Trinidad on its own would be negotiating its own way out of this suit against them from Belize. Obviously, the CARICOM Secretariat in Guyana is also named as a co-defendant in the matter because the Belizean government has claimed that they would have reported the concerns to CARICOM and CARICOM ignored their concerns. But that is a matter for the CARICOM Secretariat to handle, much in the same way that we have had to handle it in a manner that we think is best for us. In terms of the 2021 projects and initiatives for the Ministry of International Trade, I just wanted to remind us again that the budgetary allocation that we are asking for 2021 in total, both recurrent and capital, is $5,343,747. And throughout the year, we will be using that funding towards the continuing expansion of services being provided by the Bureau. I would have said earlier what some of the upgrades are. It would also allow us to do genetic mapping in terms of species of animals, including fish. For example, when the Fisheries Division sells fish, if there are queries going forward because of the addition of a PCR machine to the cadre of equipment at the Bureau, we would be able to know if you're being sold a piece of salmon and you take it to the Bureau, is it really a piece of salmon that you've paid for, or did you pay for marlin? That is to give you a very basic understanding of what that genetic clarification does. We are also conducting, as of 2021, more of the indoor and outdoor air quality testing and household inspections, building inspections, to include testing for asbestos. In the past, we would have had to ship those samples outside. In terms of CROSQ, as I indicated earlier, the Caribbean Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, they would be assisting us in 2021 to ensure that some 5 businesses in St. Kitts and Nevis are part of a pilot to become ISO 9001 certified, and Carrie Brewery would be the first among those. There is also the completion and renovation of other sections of the laboratory at the Bureau, because we haven't finished all, including metal cabinetry as well as the placement of epoxy flooring to meet international standards so that the lab can be fully accredited. A full-time metrologist would also be in place. That is simply a case of promotion because we already have somebody who can be graduated into that position. In 2021, we would be also focusing our attention on the revisions to the National Manufacturing Strategy of 2014 to 2020. Over the years, there has been limited build-out of that strategy, but nevertheless, the time has come to revisit it, not just because it has come to an end based on the years that it should have covered, but in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the harsh realities that we are being forced to recognize in terms of which businesses are more resilient than others. And as I pointed out earlier, manufacturing has shown its strength in terms of resilience under COVID. So it's the ideal opportunity for us to revise that particular strategy that would guide the build-out of the manufacturing sector for another 5-year period. A qualified local consultant has already been identified for that. For 2021, in terms of the Ministry of International Trade, we will be asking for 5 new positions in order to support the Bureau of Standards and also to support the Office of the Minister. And these positions you will note in Chapter 7 of the Volume 2 of the draft estimates are the addition of an investigations officer post upgraded to Chief Investigations Officer, a standards officer, air quality technician, an administrative assistant, and the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points Coordinator, the HACCP Coordinator. A number of other posts will be renamed, but those do not have budgetary implications because the scales remain the same. In terms of capital projects for trade, just to wrap up my discussion on trade, the main capital project, which accounts for the $670,000 being asked for, is to complete the renovations of the laboratories at Lagreet for the Bureau of Standards. In closing, as it relates to the discussion on trade and industry, I would like to indicate that the ministry has relationships with at least 9 international agencies for whom we would have to be paying contributions, some through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and some directly. And I wish to report that the ministry is compliant with all of these annual quota contributions. I now move on to the Ministry of Labor. And in 2021, the Ministry of Labor is asking for a recurrent budget addition of $1.9 million with an additional capital expenditure addition of $7.2 million for a total allocation of $9.1 million, or an increase of 167.37 over the budgetary allocation for 2020. So when we hear people say that this budget doesn't take into consideration people who are distressed and displaced when it comes to labor and employment, the figures do not lie. For 2021, there will be an increase by 167.4% in terms of the allocation to the Ministry of Labor. As I had done with the prior discussion on the Ministry of International Trade, I will do the same with Labour to point out the subjects that are covered by the Ministry of Labour. But before I do so, I would like to turn our attention to an errata that was discovered in the volume 2 of the draft estimates. If we could turn to chapter 19, page 19-7, you would note that there is an error in terms of a section called Ecclesiastical Affairs Matters. It appears that during the printing process there may have been a file override, and as a result of that, because the previous permutation of the ministry included ecclesiastical affairs, it appears that the Ministry of Finance would have missed that. So when you turn to page 19-7 under chapter 19 for the Ministry of Labor, where you see that indication in the middle of the page for ecclesiastical affairs, please note that we have already pointed out the error to finance, and the government printry has already made the change. So when the final copy of the estimates would be printed, that would not be in there. So I just wanted to explain that, because I'm sure when people saw it, they would wonder, what am I reading? But that was because of a file override that happened at the printry. However, to go back to the discussion...
And remember, just for the benefit of all, could you repeat the exact section?
Okay, it's chapter 19 of volume 2 of the draft estimates. And once you get to chapter 19, you're looking for page 19-7. So right about maybe after the first 1/3 of the text on the page, you will go down and you will see a notation pointing to some objectives relative to ecclesiastical affairs that should not be there. Okay. All right. So to go over what I would have started, in terms of the Ministry of Labor, the subjects that are covered are policy and labor relations, labor inspection, occupational safety and health, social protection, employment and related research and stats, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, international labour standards as it relates obviously to the ILO, the National Tripartite Committee made up of the social partners who are representatives of workers and employers, in other words, perhaps the Chamber of Commerce and other like-minded agencies, as well as unions, the International Organization of Employers, the IOE, the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, and the Inter-American Network for Labor Administration, going by the acronym REAL, which is a voluntary organization that falls under the Organization of American States. Now, in terms of the challenge that confronts the Ministry of Labor for 2021, as it relates to COVID, everything that we have discussed in this room has been underpinned and interlaced by COVID, which we cannot escape. And what we are seeing in terms of the global employment sector, and thankfully not much of it is happening here, is that there are trends that indicate that the pandemic has accelerated, in the words of the ILO, the future of work. The future of work meaning that had it not been for the pandemic, you would have seen a build-out in terms of the traditional understanding of how we view employment, in terms of the influence and the pervasive nature of ICTs in labor matters. You saw the bulk of it coming out in terms of the lockdowns, with people having to work remotely, having to depend more on ICTs, having to rely on digitization, and at the same time, online work. So in essence, the ILO, and we knew it already without them saying it, would have posited that the future of work is now upon us because of COVID-19. As a result of that, COVID has had, I would not say a deleterious, but a considerable negative impact on the world of work globally. We saw it here even in St. Kitts and Nevis by the fact that we have had so many claims in terms of severance, which I will come to later on in a bit. But what we are seeing here, according to the ILO's prediction, is that economic recovery will be slow and it will be uncertain. I think the Honourable Member for Number 5 made that very clear yesterday in all of his inputs as it relates to the budget, as he cited sources from the OECS, the Central Bank, and others. At the same time, we are also recognizing, as noted in the honorable mover of the bill during his budget address, that the sectors most affected by the pandemic in terms of employment are women and young people. And to that, the ILO has added working mothers, that they will be the hardest hit demographic group in terms of labor market losses due to reduced working hours. On this score, the ILO is predicting that during the first quarter, or the assessing, of 2020, the global labor income losses would have amounted to some 10.7%, or US $3.5 trillion, which equates to some 5.5% of global GDP. I will repeat that statistic. The ILO is positing that for the first quarter 2020 alone, the world would have seen global labor income losses amounting to some 10.7%, or US $3.5 trillion, which equates to some 5.5% of global GDP. That is significant. The pandemic has also forced us to see the need for economic stimulus packages to mitigate the labor market disruptions. St. Kitts and Nevis was not left out in that process. To our credit, this government has put at least $120 million stimulus into the hands of people who would have been displaced as a result of COVID-19. And of course, Social Security would have played its own part as being a socially responsible organization in terms of responding to people who are hurting at a difficult time. If these types of support systems are not in place, then more and more people will fall through the cracks, the poverty rates will improve, and at the same time, who we consider to be the working poor will become an even greater demographic. So these are matters for which we have to keep our eyes peeled in terms of understanding the vulnerabilities of certain groups and be able to respond accordingly. However, what the ILO is indicating here is that in spite of the stimulus packages that global jurisdictions would have put on the table to ease the burden and the suffering of persons, they are seeing that there's an estimated gap in terms of stimulus, economic stimulus, of some US 982 billion. So there is still a gap of 982 billion left to be filled. And in terms of low income and lower middle income countries, the gap is valued at US 45 billion when it comes to low income countries and US 937 billion when it comes to lower middle income countries. We have also witnessed, as a result of COVID-19, supply chain disruptions. Case in point is the example I gave earlier of API Harrow being requested by the Trump administration to produce parts needed for ventilators. If there was not a supply point interruption, there would be no need for that, but that is obviously the case. We are seeing an increased likelihood in the global market as it relates to employment in terms of displaced workers seeking more work to survive in the informal trading sector. And what do I mean by the informal trading sector? It means that you get a job under the table. You take a job, maybe it's day work, you don't pay any social security, the employer doesn't pay anything for you, but you take it because you're desperate. But then it means that you have no social protection if anything happens to you. You can't claim social security, you can't go and complain to the Labor Department for having adverse working conditions, because you too are breaking the law, along with your employer who has provided you with informal work. But we are seeing globally, especially in third world jurisdictions, a lot of that taking place just out of the sheer need to survive from day to day. Because most of these people are not paid wages that take them into a week or a month. They are paid job work or day work. So that is what the ILO is referring to here. We are also seeing, as a result, that persons without the necessary skill sets and opportunities will find themselves under the new COVID environment to be left out and unable to access these opportunities because they cannot make the digital transitions that are required. And if we are not careful, they will be left behind or reduced to poverty. It is for that reason why this government, if we recall, when the pandemic would have started and schools had to be closed, the former Minister of Education would have gone to the trouble with the support of the telecoms industry to ensure that there were iPads provided, laptops, whatever infrastructure, as well as the connectivity provided by internet so that learning could continue. So that is what they mean by that. When these gaps are not filled, people lose out on opportunities because they are left behind in the absence of a digital transformation of a world in which they're still living in an analog mindset then. So that is what is happening. However, the ILO is indicating that there needs to be a policy prescriptive going forward now in order to respond to 5 key challenges being posed by COVID, which every jurisdiction they are advising to take on board. And these challenges are delicate balancing and sequencing of economic and social policy, policy interventions that must be sustainable and at the right scale, filling stimulus gaps in emerging and developing economies, the need for national solidarity, again, what we keep talking about the all of society approach. That's what the ILO means here by national solidarity. And the fifth challenge that we will have to look at would be tailoring policy support for vulnerable and hard-hit groups. We would have indicated earlier who some of these are. Young people, women, working mothers, as some of the most vulnerable among them. Now, in terms of the severance payment claims, Mr. Speaker, I could not end my discussion on the Department and Ministry of Labour without speaking to that. We would have noticed that once we would have locked down the economy and the rules of the law as it relates to the Protection of Employment Act and also the provisions therein as they relate to the severance payment fund would have been such that after 12 weeks of layoff, severance is triggered, which means if you were laid off in March, come towards the end of June, you would begin to see an influx of claims coming to the Ministry of Labour for payment of severance. And that even if it's a case where you have a rogue employer who refuses to give a worker a letter of termination to trigger the application for severance, it does not stop the department from processing the claim, because the department follows the law in terms of using the 12-week benchmark as the kick-in period. And it is for that reason why we would have had such angst in the system, in the labour market system here locally, when it came to the Marriott workers, who were furloughed for the 12 weeks, but then the Marriott did not follow through by providing the letters of termination for the rank and file of their staff. However, I would like to present the data as at the close of business on Monday the 15th. Data from the Labour Commissioner indicates that as of Monday, close of business, the total number of claims received were 2,353. The total number of claims being processed right now, 1,277. The total number of claims received between the 10th and the 14th of December alone, 59. Total number of severance claims processed to date, 1,017. Total number of claims paid out to date, 916. Total number of claims awaiting payment, 101. And total amount of money paid out by the Department of Labour thus far for severance claims, $9,974,817.76. And in order to facilitate that, Mr. Speaker, I should add that traditionally the severance payment fund has always been in a state of arrears, largely due to abuses to the system, abuses committed by employers, abuses where it might have occurred in the past that even staff members within the department would have colluded with employers to put through severance claims that were not genuinely claims. I should also at the same time indicate that when it comes to severance payments, the only person who contributes to the severance payment fund is the employer. The worker does not pay a cent. 1% of payroll is deducted from the employer's full payroll number to go towards severance pay. And what it means then, it's telling us that several things are going on here. One, the fund is undercapitalized. It is in need of review. It has also demonstrated the need to fill loopholes and gaps where abuses have been taking place. But then the fund was further taxed in 2014 when the previous government introduced the long service gratuity, but then failed to put additional monies into the fund to capitalize it. So the same pot of funds which severance payment claims were being paid from is the same pot of funds that we are expected to pay long service gratuity fund. And for the sake of information, just to add for the benefit of the public, the only 2 types of employees who are eligible to receive long service gratuity by law are workers in the hospitality sector, and manufacturing workers. Those are the only two. And I said this against the backdrop that just about 2 days ago, if I'm correct, Attorney General, we had a request from a lawyer claiming long service gratuity from his own law firm. So perhaps this is the time of the ridiculous. I do not know. Anyhow, so just for the sake of clarity, the only persons who can claim from the long service gratuity are workers in the hospitality sector, i.e. the hotel and restaurant and allied services sector, and workers in the manufacturing sector. Having said that, however, Mr. Speaker, I should point out that as it relates to the long service gratuity and also the matter to do with the severance payment fund, the National Tripartite Committee has been working diligently over the past couple of years to look at amendments as it relates to these provisions under the Protection of Employment Act. At the same time, a lot of work would have been expended by my predecessor, His Excellency Ambassador Vance Amory, in terms of getting us to a point of a draft labor code which would have embodied all of the requisite pieces of labor legislation for the country. However, in light of the loopholes that we are now seeing in terms of severance and the long service gratuity, for example, the law says that once you've worked 10 years, you can claim long service gratuity. Now, if you're young enough and able-bodied enough, you could claim long service gratuity 3 times then. Because I could work 10 years for you, 10 years for representative for number 1, and 10 years for the representative for number 3. So in 30 years, you would have collected gratuity 3 times. Now that is unsustainable. So there are amendments that we are putting in place to make it eligible at the same top tier as the severance payment fund, which is the maximum 1-year payout for at least 17 years of work, so that you could get around that type of loophole. At the same time, Social Security, to their credit, would have put in place a draft piece of legislation to create an unemployment insurance fund. So had we had that before COVID, it might have eased our burden quite a bit. But in 2021, it is a matter that will be pursued by the Ministry and the Tripartite Committee, so that persons who would have lost their jobs and would have been out of work for 90 days would be eligible to claim from the fund, but would have to actively demonstrate that they are seeking new employment. So in other words, it's not intended for you to remain on it for the rest of your life. So that is a matter that is coming up. Now, the projects for 2021, in addition to the amendments that I referred to, would be in terms of ICT transformation as it relates to the ministry. We would wish to have the matter of COVID claims, etc., and others digitized so that we can get them processed a lot faster. Part of the difficulty that we have in terms of the severance claims is the fact that everything has to be done manually, not just by the ministry, but with verification from Social Security, which tracks your entire employment history to come up with what is considered your average wage, against which your eligible years that you can claim from can be calculated. So that is a major issue. And then on top of that, the Accountant General's chambers would then have to do their own audit trail to approve payments before they happen. So that is also a matter that we are looking forward to, in addition to working with His Excellency Vance Amory and also Ambassador Hull in 2021 in terms of the public sector transformation program, whereby we are moving towards a performance and productivity-based pay system and moving away from the traditional colonial increment-based system of remuneration in the public sector. So that is a project that we're looking forward to very much in the new year. There are no new HR provisions being sought by the ministry. The ministry is staffed by 27 workers as well as an additional 10 step workers, and we are ably staffed for the time being. We at the same time recognize the need for austerity, so we have not requested any additional staff because we are also looking forward to regularizing the 10 step workers that we have. And while I'm on that score, I should say a hearty thank you to the Labour Commissioner and her team for being able to process these claims given the tedium that comes with them. They are normally in the building as late as 9 p.m. And especially when it comes to the step workers, we have gotten incredible support from them. And I am pleased to announce at this point that the Ministry of Finance has agreed that in recognition for the extra work being put in by the staff, eligible staff members of the Department and Ministry of Labor, that an end-of-year honorarium is going to be paid to them for the hours that they are putting in. So that is good news for them, especially at a time when we cannot afford to pay a double salary. And it at least recognizes them for their effort. So I just wanted to add that. Our solitary capital project for 2021 would be the $7.2 million allocation that we are asking for to continue to be able to pay out the claims that are still coming in as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of our obligations to the international community, we are current in those obligations as they relate to the ILO, and also, as I indicated before, the Inter-American Network for Labor Administration, acronym RIAL, because it's a Spanish translation, and those are in the figures of 1,515 US for RIAL and 4,148 when it comes to the ILO. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would wish to indicate that we could not have concluded the work this year of the Ministry of Labor without the strong support of the stakeholders that we work with, Social Security, the social partners, the Trades and Labor Union, as well as the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. We recognize at the same time that even though the ILO's regulations state that you negotiate with the most representative organizations of employers and workers, that St. Kitts and Nevis doesn't have a big union culture, but with CSME and the continued movement of people, we will see more of the unions popping up, sector-specific, I would imagine. At the same time, there is room for opportunity from other umbrella organizations as it relates to the private sector to do more to represent the interests of their members. The Chamber of Commerce, for example, does not have more than perhaps 125 members. And based on what I indicated earlier as the total number of registered businesses in St. Kitts at being over 5,000, it tells you that the Chamber of Commerce cannot be the most representative group when it comes to employers. So nevertheless, we work with these agencies, we work with other stakeholders, we work very closely with the ILO, and we are grateful for that support, particularly the support of the staff during the last 4 or 5 months in terms of the added pressure that they've been under to process this inordinately large number of claims. With that note, Mr. Speaker, I rest my case, and again, as I started, I will end in rendering my fullest support to the Appropriation Bill 2021 of 2020. May it please.
Thank you, Honorable Wendy Phipps, Minister of State. Next contribution, please.
The opposition clearly have no interest in making a further contribution to debate. After me? Yeah. I would allow her to go, Mr. Speaker.
Matter is resolved. Yes.
My apologies, Honorable.
No problem.
Mr. Speaker, sorry.
I recognize the Honorable Dr. Jeffrey Hanley, member for St. Christopher 1, to make his contribution on the budget address.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I rise to make my presentation on the appropriation 2021 Bill 2020. My very first, Mr. Speaker, and I cherish this opportunity to speak on behalf of the good people of East Bastille, who I am so humbled to be serving at this time. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I say thank you to the good people of East Bastille for their confidence in me. Mr. Speaker, it seems like the tagline yesterday by some members was history was made. I too, Mr. Speaker, made history on June 5th, 2020. The first person to defeat a sitting minister who ran in East Bastille, having served only one term. Mr. Speaker, I also set history, having beaten that same person 3 times in 1 year, Mr. Speaker. So honorable member for number 3 and honorable member for number 11, I join you as well. If I can explain, Mr. Speaker, on June 5th and 2 times in the courts, Mr. Speaker, 1, 2, 3 times. And I move on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I listen to the member for constituency number 7 presenting the budget address, my mind went back to the days when we played the game, when we presented gifts to someone, but we hide them in several packages, well decorated. But when we remove the wrappings, Mr. Speaker, and find that treasure or that gift, it is not what you would have expected. But it was beautifully wrapped and decorated with bows. This is clear example, Mr. Speaker, that you should never judge a book by its cover, or all that glitters is not gold. But Mr. Speaker, we must look beyond the optics and deal with the real realities. The butter and bread realities, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic, as everyone would have been speaking about, has changed the world. It has resulted in several challenges, and I believe it brought many blessings, and we must always remember to give thanks. As a result, Mr. Speaker, many families were bonded. Things you did not do, COVID allowed you to do some of them. I even became, Mr. Speaker, a carpenter and a painter. I cannot overemphasize the importance, Mr. Speaker, of all of us following the protocols to remain safe. But, Mr. Speaker, we cannot blame everything on COVID, because the pandemic is only with us for a few months. But many of the problems that we are experiencing started years ago, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 3 key points that I detected: deception, mismanagement, and corruption. And if you follow my presentation, you too would be able to agree with me, Mr. Speaker. The honorable member for number 7 continually boasts of fiscal prudence. Here are a few examples of things not being what they appear to be, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member for number 7 is very excited about the over 800 new approvals for business licenses in 2020. He says that this is an evidence of his government's program to stimulate small business. I am putting it to him, Mr. Speaker, that this is evidence of people trying to make a living because of the economic contraction caused by the pandemic and a woefully inadequate stimulus package. To take credit for the creativity and resilience of the people is a brazen disrespect for our people's intelligence, Mr. Speaker. The honorable member went on further to name the new Ministry of Entertainment, Talent Development, and Entrepreneurship as the supporting structure for these new businesses. However, after 6 long months of appointing a minister, as it is said, Mr. Speaker, nothing akip, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely nothing. Just wrappings, Mr. Speaker. The minister with responsibility for this new ministry, I listened to her very carefully. And Mr. Speaker, she offered no budgetary specifics into what this new ministry will be delivering. Nothing close to what I just heard from the honorable senator opposite. Where is the ministry based so that people can go and receive the help that they so need, Mr. Speaker? Or is it a ghost ministry? Deception again, Mr. Speaker. Because in fact, Mr. Speaker, after 6 months, the country should have been in a position to know that this ministry is located in government headquarters or in the Sands Complex or some other address. But nothing after 6 months. Why is it taking so long?
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I believe if the honourable member would have been following the government and what we have been saying about the new ministry, he would know that on identifying a PS, we also identified that the ministry is located at the National ICT Centre. So I'm not sure. He would also note that this is a new ministry. We are operating under a 2020 budget, and no consideration was given to the new ministry when we came here in 2019 to debate the 2020 budget. And it was always said that once we are in the 2021 budget cycle, the new ministry will continue to operate and would be able to show. We've also said, and I said it in my presentation, that we are doing the consultations with persons within the ministry. So I know he's not in the creative and innovative space, so he's not aware. But I just wanted to make that clear.
Mr. Speaker, absolute nonsense. And it sounds very good, but I ask the question, where is the ministry located? Mr. Speaker, you know better than that, the ministry. And I move on. Mr. Speaker, paragraph 101, page 50. And I read, we believe that all state entities, that's in the budget, Mr. Speaker, should be financially self-sustaining. For some time now, some of the state entities have become a burden on the Treasury as they are unable to meet the financial outlay required to maintain their operations. It does not make sense for us to carry on operating these entities that, well, it's a typo, they had have fulfilled, but I figured it should have been have not fulfilled their primary mandate. If this situation is left unattended, we run the risk not only of allowing inefficiencies in the public sector, but also building up unsustainable levels of public debt. The fundamental position of the government is that the operation of failing state-owned entities would be evaluated and a determination made in respect of closure, rationalization, or amalgamation. Mr. Speaker, how can statutory entities be efficient when board continues to be swelled with cronies, family and friends with no technical experts and clear conflict of interest, Mr. Speaker? It's out there that even a magistrate is on a board. Mr. Speaker, board fees continues to increase without any requirements for performance. I therefore ask, when last were the financial accounts laid for these entities such as Casper, Frigate Bay Development Corporation, the Craft House, Whitegate Corporation, and NHC, and the Honorable Member for 5 now including Solid Waste. In addition, Mr. Speaker, there are entities that the government is sole owner of, such as Kelec, UDC, ZIZ, and the cable. So when are we going to get reports, Mr. Speaker, on their management? As Calypsonians say, Mr. Speaker, we want to know, at least as a first-time MP, I am interested, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to share.
On a point of order.
Yes.
I would just point out to the member for St. Christopher 1 that he is mentioning corporations that are limited liability companies, that are registered companies, and are not statutory bodies. There's a distinction, and I think you should make that distinction, because there's no requirement for them to report here in Parliament, because they have annual general meetings where the government is a shareholder, and therefore that is the relationship with some of those you mentioned. Please make the distinction.
Thank you very much, Honorable Senator, Attorney General, Senator. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to share with this Honorable House one such entity that is in my constituency. Mr. Speaker, one of the largest, if not the largest state entity is Casper. The Labour government in 2010 reformed the largest state entity, Mr. Speaker, Casper, and turned it into a viable, sustainable entity. After the restructuring exercise, Mr. Speaker, the stabilized organization was just about 200 employees operating profitably. Today, I am interested in finding out what's the staff count at Casper. The gross mismanagement of this most critical government entity, I am told, has a staff count in excess of 400 persons. Mr. Speaker, I sat on the board that oversaw the restructuring, so I know the challenges and the determination that went into making this possible. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, at that time, my board fees was $550. Now, Mr. Speaker, $1,500 is the present board fees, or it could be higher.
There's no board fee at Casper at $5,500.
I did not say 5,000.
How much you said?
I said I got $550 while I was a board member.
And your last point was?
Could you tell the Honorable House what's the board fee while you're on the floor?
No, I'm not going to tell you. You got to say what it is, since you know.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. The board fees, Mr. Speaker, are much more than $550. But these were the same set of people, Mr. Speaker, who went the length and breadth just before they got into government that the board fees is this a lot of money, and people on several boards. And on their entry in 2015, Mr. Speaker, there were increases.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if he's directing this to Casper, but since 2015, there has been no board change in terms of remuneration at Casper. That is, whatever the board fee was in 2014, in 2020, it remains the same.
Mr. Speaker, should I interpret paragraph 101 to mean that we might just wake up and hear that workers are sent home in these difficult times, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, Election really has consequences. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member, he would have an idea of the fees.
And he told you they haven't changed some of the statement.
And I went on or came back to say that it was more than 550. I never quoted what I did before.
You said 1,200. After 1,500. You said 1,500. You said it went from 550 to 1,500.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw and I move on. Mr. Speaker, this is indeed mismanagement and corruption. Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about you're not following the presentation. Mr. Speaker, I ask the question, where are the surpluses that were generated from 2010 to at least 2015 when Team Unity took over? Mr. Speaker, if we are talking about accountability and transparency...
On a point of order, I think that the member for number 1 should indicate from the annual audited reports that were tabled here in this parliament what those surpluses were. Because I'm certain that there were a number of deficit budgets that were tabled here between 2010 and 2015. As we recall, in 2011, we had to have a moratorium on increases in salaries by civil servants for 3 years because there were financial problems in our country after 2010. There was a haircut that was spoken to. The Methodist Church took 50%. A number of entities took haircuts because there were deficits. There was an increase in electricity of up to 86% rates, as well as water went up by 600%. That was increased because of those deficits. There were no surpluses in 2010, 2011, 2012.
Mr. Speaker, I ask the question, and I could be guided. When was the last time we had this CASPO report being laid? Or let me ask the question, Mr. Speaker, because the Honorable Senator indicated that there are some who have the responsibility to do that. Is CASPO responsible or has the responsibility of sharing their financial reports with the Honorable House, Mr. Speaker?
You speak about CASPO the government in terms of 2010 to 2015.
Mr. Speaker, I am told that CASPO now owes Social Security millions of dollars just to keep their operations going. If this is so, Mr. Speaker, this is scandalous. Mr. Speaker, can't be happening after all that work that would have been put into ensuring that CASPO was placed on a sustainable track. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this is a point of order. I think the member for number 1 is fishing. He's on a fishing expedition. He doesn't know the facts, but he's in here saying he believes it is this and he believes it is that. In fact, the figures here reflect that in 2010, CASPO lost $6.5 million. Who was in the government then? When they did the restructuring in 2011, they made a profit of $578,000. What has been done since Team Unity has gotten in? Since Team Unity has been in 2015, SCASPA made $12.1 million. In 2016, we made $10.6 million. In 2017, $9 million. That's a government with one of its entities operating in a financial position of the highest order. And we built the second cruise pier, costing $100 and something million. So when you're talking about SCASPA, have your facts right.
Yeah, we still can't blame everything on COVID. Mr. Speaker, I will continue. Mr. Speaker, all of the concrete that was poured up at the port for reasons only known to ones who benefited, can this be the reason why they're in that position today, Mr. Speaker? All you're hearing is flowering, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, later I will raise the cruise pier matter as the Honourable Member for 4 just indicated. But the key question here, Mr. Speaker, is where has the money gone? And why in the budget address it is being brought at this time where there should be good tidings and great joy? And to me, Mr. Speaker, if you're talking about all these entities that you're going to have to cut down and do all sorts of things, it would appear to me that you are putting some of these staff on notice that you will be retrenched while the real perpetrators, Mr. Speaker, as the saying goes, continue to live high on the high. Rest assured, the electorate will surely remember this COVID year and the injustice that will soon come to them. Again, Mr. Speaker, election have consequences, and it's all about glitter, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I now highlight on page 17 and 19, Mr. Speaker, in the audit report, where there were a number of ministries with expenditure which exceeded the original budgeted amount. But Mr. Speaker, there were some that really jumped out at me. In the office of the Prime Minister, $1 million was provided for travel allowance and communication expenses. $1 million, Mr. Speaker. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, extra monies, $953,000 funded for the independence celebration. But Mr. Speaker, we know independence is an annual thing, so we should be budgeting correctly for these activities, Mr. Speaker, rather than having the situation where all of this, these large sums, Mr. Speaker, is very telling. Mr. Speaker, with COVID, how many persons left the island to be traveling, Mr. Speaker? Did COVID cause all of this, Mr. Speaker? If we are planning properly, Mr. Speaker,
It's 2019, sir, 2019.
we ought to make sure that we get our figures correctly, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, the member for St. Christopher 1 is referring to the Director of Audit's report that he has. And he seems to be mixing up the years, because the Director of Audit report is for the calendar year, January 2019 to December 2019. The COVID pandemic came to St. Kitts and Nevis and the world in 2020. So the travel referred to there is for last year, not for this year when there is COVID. And the borders were closed.
Thank you very much, but Mr. Speaker, that's okay, I'm not intimidated. Mr. Speaker, I still find $1 million to be an excessive amount, Mr. Speaker. On page 22, Mr. Speaker,
That's why you have a public accounts committee. Speak to the leader of the opposition. He can look into those things.
there is still a concern that projects are not being properly planned, Mr. Speaker, from in the audit report. This can be seen by the number of projects without expenditure and the number of projects that continue to be rolled forward from year to year without implementation, Mr. Speaker. According to the Director of Audit Report for 2019, again, Mr. Speaker, on page 19, and I quote, "It is noted that several ministries applied for appropriation warrants to cover additional costs of personal emoluments during 2019. This has been due to the large part of amount of arrears of salaries for government employees that were paid out, of during the year. This situation is more notably with the Ministry of Education, where some teachers did not receive increment for several years." And she went on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I would want to find out is what would have caused this, Mr. Speaker. Is it a case where we have people who perhaps think that they are gods and hold up people's increments, Mr. Speaker? I'm just asking, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you look at paragraph 56 in the Prime Minister's budget, Honourable Member for 7, budget, the government's budget. It refers to, Mr. Speaker, support from Cuba and the Republic of China on Taiwan. And I think it's very fitting, Mr. Speaker, for me to sincerely thank the governments of Cuba and Taiwan for their support in the fight against COVID. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, I must say that during those times there was a call from Dr. Terence Drew in recruiting assistance from Cuba. I too would want to thank him because eventually the government listened. But Mr. Speaker, today I am very passionate about a situation that was brought to my attention. Here we have Cuban nurses and specialists and doctors who are here working and helping us in the fight of COVID-19. Also, Mr. Speaker, we had a number of our local nurses who would have journeyed to Cuba and earned their degree in nursing. But for some strange reason, they could not get the necessary, whether it be promotion that should have been accorded to them. I would want to know, Mr. Speaker, if at a time like now, seeing that you have the Cuban nurses and all of them here, can't we do something for those nurses? Because the training they would have received in Cuba is the same training, Mr. Speaker, that these professionals and specialists would have gone through. So I'm asking the honorable member for number 3 to take that into consideration, because there are a number of them, I'm told, they have even gone on or they're pursuing their master's degree. And we really need to assist them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, refers to the, Mr. Speaker, paragraph 57 refers, but I visit the hospital, I haven't seen them in, the honorable member for number 3, I'm hearing her saying that they were assisted, but I'm not seeing them in the red belt or whatever, which indicates some level of promotion, but I will move on, Mr. Speaker.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the nurses, there's a regional exam that the nurses need to be able, the RNA exam that they need to pass in order for them to become a registered nurse and move on in the ranks of nursing. We're trying to assist these nurses to make sure that they are able to pass this exam so that they can move forward. So the ministry is doing what they can do in order to be able to assist these nurses. So as long as they pass the exam, then they'll be able to, exactly, those who have passed would have already moved on, and until the others pass, they will not be able to. It's a regional body to make sure that within our region we have some type of certification and registration for all of our nurses. So I just want to make sure that persons understand that and not take this away thinking that we're bringing in nurses when we do have qualified nurses.
Mr. Speaker, I ask a question. The nurses who came from Cuba, who are here, operating in our hospital, did they have to do a regional exam to carry out what they are carrying out, Mr. Speaker? Sorry about that. Mr. Speaker, paragraph 57 refers to the health system being guided by the National Pandemic Preparedness and Response Plan, the budget address. Yes. But what is strange, Mr. Speaker, is that we failed to acknowledge that Team Unity inherited such a plan, and it's unfortunate. This was first developed, Mr. Speaker, for Cricket World Cup, then expanded for the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, which became the template, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we continue to fight this pandemic, and specifically dealing now with the quarantine of persons entering, I ask the question, why are we not testing on the day of arrival at the airport, as I am seeing happening in other countries, Mr. Speaker? Good best practices. Mr. Speaker, from my understanding, the science has advanced and the virus level peaks after 48 hours. So the RT-PCR would indicate the presence of the virus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask because in Tortola, for example, their model, like us, you test 3 days before. They do a test on arrival with tracking bracelets and the app on their phone, but they're driven also, similar process, to a designated area of isolation. But on the 5th day, they are tested again, Mr. Speaker. And if the test results in a negative, they eventually leave that quarantine area. Mr. Speaker, is it in anything, Mr. Speaker, well, the honorable member is saying she speaks about it every Wednesday, but yeah. Mr. Speaker, what I'm asking, with the science that is being advanced, would there be any consideration that the quarantine or the whole process could come down to a 7-day, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, we had the stem cell scandal and the herpes scandal. The nation was told that investigations are ongoing. Are these investigations still ongoing, or do we have a report to share with the country, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, paragraph 58 in the same budget report refers to investing heavily in this health sector over 5 years. But, Mr. Speaker, there was no breakdown given, Mr. Speaker. The investment favored construction or constructing buildings and hiring private security. No evidence provided about improving real health care resources such as the workers and equipment and supplies, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, in the audit report of 2018, there was a line item under the Ministry of Health that spoke to an additional $900,000 that was allocated for private security services at the JNF hospital. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if that same amount is in the 2019 audit report, as I did not see it. I don't know if it is a larger amount, Mr. Speaker, but $900,000 in 2018 would have been paid to the security services at the JNF. Mr. Speaker, I am a regular visitor at the JNF. Matter of fact, it's part of my ministry of caring. I would go there very often. I won't say daily because sometimes you don't have the time. And feeding patients, comforting and encouraging them, and even sometimes surprising our nurses with meals. Mr. Speaker, why should patients have to endure sleeping on dirty sheets for days? Mr. Speaker, I personally had to remove one after 6 days, and this is no story, Mr. Speaker. I am not tearing down, Mr. Speaker. I am just dealing with some of the realities. And my question is this the best investment that we can make at this time, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we have very dedicated and very hard-working nurses. They did a top job dealing with my mom. I see the pressure they are faced with, Mr. Speaker, and I too feel their pain, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you were to visit the psychiatric ward, and if you have a heart, Mr. Speaker, you must cry because it is in a deplorable state, Mr. Speaker. I did an internship there, Mr. Speaker, and I even donated at one time a basketball wing down there. Mr. Speaker, these are things that need to be addressed urgently, Mr. Speaker. Painting a wall here and there is not all, Mr. Speaker. Not when at times basic medications are not available. Sometimes not even, Mr. Speaker, a pillow. But $900,000, almost $1 million spent on security. Sometimes on a good day, you'll find more security than patients on a ward, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, don't get me wrong. I'm extremely happy for everyone who has a job because people are feeling real hardship. But Mr. Speaker, I get the calls every day, and I am obligated to fight for my people. But for us to invest $900,000, Mr. Speaker, alone, I find that to be a lot, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr.
point of
Speaker.
order, please. I think in terms of this $900,000 which is being harped on,
the member opposite needs to put it into context. Because, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that you had security issues at JNF, which would have necessitated the hiring of private security at the hospital. The member opposite said he has visited the hospital on several occasions. And he should know that even before the advent of this team unity government, that you had persons who went to the hospital and fired gunshots at patients and other persons at the hospital. Hence, the investment in security at the hospital was intended not only to protect innocent persons at the hospital, but to protect staff and other persons there. I am certain that staff and patients at the hospital feel much more secure at the hospital than they would have felt before. We have had issues with the fencing, the openness at the hospital, etc. And it is out of a need for adequate security at the hospital that the government took a decision to invest in private security at the hospital. It has come at a cost, but I am certain that when persons are in the hospital trying to recuperate, they want to be able to recuperate in an environment where they don't have to worry about criminals entering the hospital trying to attack other persons, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I must make a point in relation to that. It's a financial matter, and therefore the Ministry of Finance has been involved. I noticed that the member for number one, made the point about this 900,000 in a way to infer there was something irregular or corrupt. Said corrupt earlier. Did hear that. I think the member needs to withdraw that. It is an
I have to interject here and say that yes, there was some reference made to, or the use made of the word corrupt, but that was some time earlier in the presentation, and I would have preferred. Yeah, but we have now gone back to discuss his use of the word corrupt. But the point I am making, yes, no, but the point I am making is that I would have preferred that at the time of him using the term corrupt, that was the time for a point of order to be made or that be rebutted. It was some time ago that he did use the term corrupt.
And Mr. Speaker, it wasn't in relation to...
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't allowed to finish my point respectfully if the member would allow me to come a point of order. On a point of order. And I'm not prolonging, but he did use, sure there were interventions from the deputy that would advance the point. But the substantive matter is that he described, same point to which the member is referring, the 900,000, that is what is on the floor. He described it as being a corrupt premise.
Yes, I remember.
But
hear you. But the difference with what the difference here is that he used the term corrupt early in his presentation. There was no objection, there was no point of order made when he did that. So it would have been at that time that I would have allowed a point of order. Yes, but we can't come. Well, honourable members, we can't come half an hour later.
Beyond that point.
Yes, please.
Beyond that point, respectfully, same subject matter. I think it's important for the member to be aware that there was a tender for that service. A tender supervised by the relevant entity. 3 tenders were placed. One of them from a firm in number 1. 3 tenders were placed. And this one was adjudged by the relevant security personnel and others involved at the hospital as the most responsive tender and the least price tender that had come forward. That is what it is. There's nothing corrupt, there's nothing untoward. It was the best of procurement practices. 3 tenders submitted in relation to the matter and adjudged by a professional in order to deal with what the member for number 5 made, the threats at the hospital, where criminals were entering on the compound. Ask when last that has happened up there. Ask when last. You come with those kind of things.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I think
Corruption is over there in the program you're involved in.
Thank you. I think the point of order that order, please. The point of order made that you have articulated finally with respect to it being a tender and so on, I think that speaks specifically to this $900,000+. And so, you know, in that case, to me, it's quite in order to speak to the tender issue at that time. Continue, Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, why are we turning back blood donors? I thought, Mr. Speaker, that blood is life. Is there a problem at the blood bank? If the refrigerator is no longer adequate and not working, I think we need to replace it, Mr. Speaker, and do it urgently. I also suggest, Mr. Speaker, that perhaps we could get 2 and be modern by placing one of them in theater. So in the event that surgeries are being done and any emergencies, Mr. Speaker, rather than running down or calling out someone, perhaps it could be right there at hand. Mr. Speaker, but we have been talking about vaccines. And if vaccines that must be stored at -70 degrees. And if we are having issues with our blood, Mr. Speaker, I can only imagine
Mr. Speaker, on a
what
point
could
of
be.
order, there is no issue with any blood or any refrigeration for the blood bank at the hospital. I've heard this being said on the street, and now they're bringing this into Parliament. That is not the case, and I would really wish if the member would at least, if he certainly cares about where the blood is stored and refrigeration, he knows me well enough where he can ask a question to get the proper clarification before coming into this honourable house and just speaking hearsay on the road, Mr. Speaker, and I would expect better. May it please you.
Mr. Speaker, it is not any hearsay, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would have thought that during the presentation, you would have heard that some of our EMTs might have been given an opportunity to upgrade themselves as paramedics by going off to study. We promised that to the EMTs, Mr. Speaker. So at least we should try to follow that through, even one. But Mr. Speaker, I must also welcome the new trainees that are there right now and wish them well. Mr. Speaker, the country is concerned about the conflict of interest and the violation of the integrity in public life provision, where the city scanned house at the JNF is owned by private interests, Mr. Speaker. And in the 2018 Director of Audit Report, indicated that there was an additional $100,000 payment to Diagnostic Inc. for CT scan services.
What is that?
Who is Diagnostic Inc.?
No, it's what we're paying for.
And Mr. Speaker, why can't we invest in our CT scan and MRI, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, in paragraph 59, the payments for vaccine, according to the press release from PAHO, Director Dr. Etienne, to qualify for external support, there were two conditions: the completion of a national plan, inclusive of a health promotion strategy and a communication strategy. So according to the member for 7 in his announcement at the church, the Federation has paid a down payment of $800,000 for access to the vaccine. The question is, did we benefit from external assistance like all of the other OECS countries, or did the allocation come from revenue? In paragraph 60, Mr. Speaker, it refers to the National Strategic Plan for Health 2017-2022. Was this plan published, Mr. Speaker? Why didn't I hear or heard of any public consultation, Mr. Speaker? Also, the overall budget is $65.9 million, whereas $74 million was spent in 2020. $62 million initially, than the additional $12.4 million. Mr. Speaker, if heaven forbids there is a community outbreak and increase in hospitalization, extra money will be required. Where will this come from, Mr. Speaker? The Parliament and the nation ought to know, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the campaign, the government erected a large billboard stating that a new hospital was coming. In the address by the Honorable Member for 3, she stated that the hospital upgrades, inclusive of the kitchen, the morgue, laundry, and the original JNF, will now be a phase 3 project as proposed, Mr. Speaker. But according to the Director of Audit report on page 22, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, the Ministry of Health spent almost $4 million, or 50% of its budgeted $7 million. The $3 million JNF General Hospital Development Phase 3 project did not materialize for the 4th year in a row. It is in the audit's report, Mr. Speaker. So imagine we learn of this after hearing surplus after surplus. This is year after year of nothing after nothing. Mr. Speaker, I move to raise some concerns in relation to social development. The Honourable Member of 7 and the Minister of Finance continues to express grave concerns about the triple dipping and possibly the quadrupling dipping, Mr. Speaker. That triple constitutes the PAP, or the STEP, or the PEP, the PAP, and the COVID response, and now possibly, Mr. Speaker, with much said yesterday, perhaps the peace initiative. Since he is concerned, and rightfully so, I recommend that we go back to the men's program, Mold, Empower, Nurture, and Direct Families in St. Kitts and Nevis program that the government squashed, Mr. Speaker. But imagine, Mr. Speaker, in Nevis, the Model Rise is being implemented. These, Mr. Speaker, were best practices of regional and international acclaim. The main reason why the Minister of Finance is concerned about the triple dipping is that his government did not follow best practices as it relates to those persons who are qualified, the eligibility. All about a vote and then we suffer. Mr. Speaker, there are competent persons, I would imagine, in the ministry that would be able to guide him as he intends to make changes, Mr. Speaker. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that he gets it right, Mr. Speaker, and the real persons benefit. Mr. Speaker, as I move to community development, it is my hope that once we have effectively managed COVID and gatherings of increased sizes can be facilitated, that the access to community centers by the opposition can be fairly considered and facilitated, Mr. Speaker. I have a number of programs, Mr. Speaker, that I intend to roll out in my constituency, and they are designed for all of the people, not on a political line, Mr. Speaker. All of the people, and they should have access to the community center, Mr. Speaker. I was elected to serve all of the people, Mr. Speaker. There comes a time when we must separate the politics from what we must do and do it right. Because, Mr. Speaker, it's public knowledge, all of the community centers that were built, they were built under the Labour government with the exception of the one that was recently completed in Lodge. Mr. Speaker, another concern I wish to address is the reach of the Child Welfare, Mr. Speaker, Board. As we know it, that this is a legally established entity based on the legislation. However, Mr. Speaker, since about 2017, the OECS Commission has advised the government that the mandate and reach of the board is an overreach. Mr. Speaker, a board cannot administer and manage a system. This, Mr. Speaker, has caused major challenges in that ministry, Mr. Speaker. And in order for us to have good working relationships, we must ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we treat our workers well. Cases are lagging behind, Mr. Speaker, all because of personalities and some would have reached or circulated in the social media, Mr. Speaker. We urgently need to address that. Mr. Speaker, it's over 5 years, just about, maybe short of that, and there is still the absence of the Ombudsman, who serves as the people's advocate against discrimination, victimization, and general disservice by civil servants. I would hope that this is addressed, Mr. Speaker. I would say to social development, in regards to moving forward, they move forward on best practices, evidence-based, people empowerment, and we must move, Mr. Speaker, from handout to hands up. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Honourable Member for number 5 in his presentation would have made reference to government making the promise that the step workers would be given the opportunity to be on government's payroll and government service, but due to the pandemic, that is not possible. But Mr. Speaker,
You raise a point of order. That is certainly not what I said yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I did indicate yesterday that the government has taken a policy decision not to bring on any new workers at this point in time because government finances are in the first instance affected by the COVID pandemic. Secondly, that government has given a commitment to the step workers to make them permanent. So as a result of that, and that process is ongoing, the government, as a result of those two things, the government has taken the policy decision not to take on any additional workers at this point in time. That is different to what the member for number 1 has stated just now, and I would wish for him to retract that, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. But the announcement, Mr. Speaker, okay, I retract what I after you would have clarified in terms of the government. Yes, but Mr. Speaker, the point I want to make here, Mr. Speaker, is that the announcement to take on the step workers as of July 1st was made during the pandemic. It was made during the pandemic. So why entice them and then now it appears as though you are deceiving them, Mr. Speaker? It appears, Mr. Speaker, the coup spear continues to be a scandal, and there are questions the country still seek answers. Have we resolved the issues surrounding the second coup spear that cannot be used up to this day, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it was our local companies who invested in this venture. And the people, I should add, because Social Security is the people's money. And we need to know exactly what's the situation with the cruise pier. I would have heard this morning that the cruise pier is in excess of 150 or something like that $million. And I would assume that we are referring to US dollars. But we still can't use the pier.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what the member for constituency 1 is saying. We were all in here in December of 2019 when we had 4 huge ships down there, 2 of which were using the second cruise pier. We all know at the moment that no ships are coming in. And the pier has been used. So there's no issue of its use as we stand today.
Mr. Speaker, another ball and a gift.
Honourable Member, just allow me to interject something that I think would at least guide those who are not. Maybe I should put it this way. There's a particular rule which states that once a member is presenting, if he misrepresents anything that an earlier member who spoke would have said, he has the right to rise and clarify. It's not necessarily a point of order, but it's a point of clarification. So I do give a lot of flexibility in that direction. So I just want you to be aware that even though you may feel there have been quite a number of points of order raised and clarification, the members are well within their right to, as often as they fit, and if I consider it to be in good order, to allow it. In particular, there's a rule 70, of the standing order 39.5, which states a member who has spoken on a question may, with the Speaker's permission, again be heard to offer explanation of some material part of his or her speech which he or she claims has been misrepresented, but he or she shall not introduce new matter. So, again, once you would have stated something that a member feels misrepresents what he or she said, they have the right to rise and rebut. You may continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm also told, Mr. Speaker, that arbitration right now, so far, is in the tune of $10 million. Mr. Speaker, according to the contract, Mr. Speaker, they went to arbitration for the last 8 months, Mr. Speaker. And it is now at a tune of $10 million. Mr. Speaker, all I'm trying to do is to get the answers regarding the spoiled pier. They are talking about cruise ships at the pier when they fully well know, Mr. Speaker, that the cruise pier was designed to accommodate a certain class of ships. That has not happened yet, Mr. Speaker, because of the issues that are there. Now, if we had the freedom of information legislation in effect, and not just for show, there would be no need to ask these questions, as all 55,000 of us would have had the answers at our fingertips, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, history of infrastructural development under my predecessor, all the projects under that individual, Mr. Speaker, were without proper consultation, over budgeted, and have issues with utilization. We see it, Mr. Speaker, at the east and even the west bus terminal. On the northern side, on the west side bus terminal, Mr. Speaker, there's not even an extension of the sidewalk. You'll have to literally be walking in the road, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we look at what's happening on Wellington Road, and I'm in my constituency now, 5 houses delivered to the people of constituency number 1 in 5 years. But on the town houses at Taylor's are the only homes that were constructed, Mr. Speaker. At Wellington Apartments, Mr. Speaker, why would we have 24 OSA units sitting down for over a year? Is it because they are not usable, because no back door, no windows, Mr. Speaker? What is the situation, Mr. Speaker, with those apartments? And the list goes on and on, Mr. Speaker. No EIA presented on many projects, including the old road, by Mr. Speaker. The honorable member for number 5 indicated in his presentation, indicated that there are some issues with the water quality at Shadwell's 2 wells. Shadwell 2 wells. I think, Mr. Speaker, at this time, I must offer commendations to the workers at that site for being able to identify the issue and advocating for the matter to be addressed. Without them, we could have been drinking water with 8 times the acceptable level of acid, Mr. Speaker. Kudos to those guys in the water department. I could only imagine how many lives could have gone. But I would hope, Mr. Speaker, as the honorable member indicated, that they intend to do something. I would hope that it would be a priority area, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on page 37 and 38 in the Prime Minister's, in the government's budget, it speaks to the solar farm, Mr. Speaker. And I just read quickly. Just erecting a 35.6 megawatts MW solar plant and a 44.2 megawatt hour MW battery storage facility in the Royal Bastille Valley National Park, aka, Mr. Speaker, and I call it the aquifer Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would have spoken all during my campaign about the importance of water, water being life, and I continue, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that no form of contamination of our precious water takes place, Mr. Speaker. Any project, Mr. Speaker, that can benefit our people, I welcome them. But we must be cautious of effects. According to a press release from the developers, an EIA was conducted for this project. How are we learning of this via this medium, Mr. Speaker? Why didn't we have a town hall meeting to discuss such a project of this nature? I think, Mr. Speaker, it is not too late for us to have that forum, even via Zoom, so that we can have persons within the areas being able to share their thoughts and even their concerns, Mr. Speaker. I thought by now, Mr. Speaker, that we would have learned from the Bacchanal, and I just said the Bacchanal, that we would have had with the BHS. And copies of the EIA would have made public for all of us to review. Don't we deserve this courtesy, Mr. Speaker? I ask, where can I go to get a copy of the EIA of this $70 million US project, Mr. Speaker? But, Mr. Speaker, what is the obsession with the Bastille Valley aquifer? Again, why that location? Don't we think that our water could be threatened? Mr. Speaker, why so much land space, noting the high volume of sun exposure in a tropical nation like ours? What is the basis of tender for the developers, Mr. Speaker? Tenure. Tenure. This is an energy project. Project like this must be owned, I believe, by Kitishans and Nevisions. Entities such as Social Security and investment opportunities and other investment opportunities for individuals could have been partners, Mr. Speaker. Something similar to what would have happened with the pier, Mr. Speaker. But I feel this government wants to deliver us back to colonialism as opposed to making us owners of our own resources. We are moving backward by having our patrimony owned by outsiders, Mr. Speaker, sorry. Did we not learn from our experience with nationalization of our sugar lands, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. Because when we are speaking about patrimony and making reference to the land, the impression is being given to the public that the land on which the solar farm is to be located has been sold to persons from overseas. That is certainly not, I said the impression is being given. Mr. Speaker, You want to raise a point of order too? Mr. Speaker, I continue. The land has been leased, and as such, the land remains the property of the government of St. Kitts and Nevis.
Mr. Speaker, why are we building a solar farm again on our Bastille Valley? What if something goes wrong, Mr. Speaker?
You should move your house from off of it.
Why is the lithium battery storage plant being built on the aquifer?
From off of it.
Mr. Speaker, the lithium toxicity affects bones, the liver, kidneys, and the brains, just to highlight a few effects, Mr. Speaker. We must think of people first, Mr. Speaker, and thoroughly plan out these projects, because we can have repercussions in the future, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, for number 1, St. Christopher 1, your time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask for 3 more minutes? No, I'm almost done. I'll ask for half an hour, Mr. Speaker, but I won't use it up. Thank you very much.
The question is that the Honourable Member has requested an additional half of an hour. Those in favour? Those against? Continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, I emphasize the point, Mr. Speaker, that we must thoroughly thought out our projects, Mr. Speaker. And we must not appear as if we are doing things in a battle. I am certain that if we had brought persons together, like I said earlier, whether via Zoom or in a room, we would be able, I believe, to even better what might have been proposed because of the rich minds that we have as a people, and especially in East Bastille. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, I don't think it is too late for us to have a discussion on this matter. And I would ask the Honourable Member for number 5 to consider when we would be able to have that discussion. Mr. Speaker, I would have asked several questions, and I have also shared recommendations even during the time when I might have been interrupted. But I am one who is not easily moved and will continue to hold my own, Mr. Speaker. May it please you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member for St. Christopher 1, Dr. Jeffrey Hanley. Honourable Members, we will now proceed on the adjournment for lunch. I propose exactly 1 hour. That being the case, this Honourable House stands adjourned until 2:15 p.m. today.
In the headlines, DEC say working to establish cocoa as a main income earner for Dominica, expunging the records of convicted marijuana users listed among government's top achievements for 2020, and a one-stop shop for local herbal products opens its
to accomplish your wildest dreams. The power to set a goal and achieve it. And we're doing so in the moments when you need us most. We think of you in all we do. Because we're not just an energy provider. We are tested, committed, efficient, and most of all, we are an electricity company that you can depend on. And we wouldn't have it any other way. Skellig, powering your community with reliability and responsibility.
Do you have a large electricity bill? At Skellig, we help you to stay connected with our easy payment arrangements. Just walk into Skellig's customer service department and ask about our deferred payment arrangement, which helps you keep your current and outstanding bill up to date. And most of all, keeping you connected. Speak to our friendly customer service reps today. For more info, call 465-2000 or visit us on Facebook. Skellig now introduces eBiz online bill payments. Pay your bills online anytime, anywhere, using your computer or cell phone. Pay using your debit or credit card and see your balance in real time. Schedule auto bill pay and receive notifications via email. Visit Skellig today and sign up for eBiz online bill payments. It's that easy. For more info, call 465-2000 or visit us on Facebook.
Skellig's interactive voice response system, a new 24-hour automated call-in service. Access it now at 465-2000 to report faults, receive bill balances, and for the first time ever, you can now make bill payments over the phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Access it now by calling 465-2000. We know there are moments when life just doesn't go as planned, and our days pretty much takes us where it wants to. But for every missed occasion, there's a great opportunity. We are making it easier to make bill payments, report faults, and receive bill balances through our automated call-in service available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Simply call 465-2000 and say or press 2 to access our automated customer service system. Say or press 2 to make a payment via credit card. Enter your 8-digit Skellig account number as seen on your bill. Enter the amount you wish to pay without a decimal point. For example, enter 2000 for a $20 payment. Have your credit card on hand to enter your credit card number, expiration date, and security number. One phone call gives you the power to regain control of your day. Skillex Interactive Voice Response System. Skillex, powering responses. We know what it feels like to have your head in the game, to be in charge, and reign supreme. And we also know what it feels like to have that taken away from you. But for every missed occasion, there's a great opportunity. Simply call 465-2000. Say or press 1 to report an outage. Enter your account number or telephone number to report the outage. Clearly explain the cause of your power outage. We can even call you back to let you know when the power is restored. One phone call gives you the power to regain control of your day. Skillex Interactive Voice Response System. Skillex, powering responses.
We're giving you the power to create lasting memories, to accomplish your wildest dreams, the power to set a goal and achieve it. And we're doing so in the moments when you need us most. We think of you in all we do, because we're not just an energy provider. We are tested, committed, efficient, and most of all, we are an electricity company that you can depend on. And we wouldn't have it any other way. Skillex, powering your community with reliability and responsibility.
Do you have a large electricity bill? At Skillex, we help you to stay connected with our easy payment arrangements. Just walk into Skillex Customer Service Department and ask about our deferred payment arrangement, which helps you keep your current and outstanding bill up to date. And most of all, keeping you connected. Speak to our friendly customer service reps today. For more info, call 465-2000 or visit us on Facebook. Skillex now introduces eBiz online bill payments. Pay your bills online, anytime, anywhere, using your computer or cell phone. Pay using your debit or credit card and see your balance in real time. Schedule auto bill pay and receive notifications via email. Visit Skillex today and sign up for eBiz online bill payments. It's that easy. For more info, call 465-2000 or visit us on Facebook.
Skillex Interactive Voice Response System, a new 24-hour automated call-in service. Access it now at 465-2000 to report faults, receive bill balances, and for the first time ever, you can now make bill payments over the phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Access it now by calling 465-2000. We know there are moments when life just doesn't go as planned, and our days pretty much takes us where it wants to. But for every missed occasion, there's a great opportunity. We are making it easier to make bill payments, report faults, and receive bill balances through our automated call-in service available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Simply call 465-2000 and say or press 2 to access our automated customer service system. Say or press 2 to make a payment via credit card. Enter your 8-digit Skillex account number as seen on your bill. Enter the amount you wish to pay without a decimal point. For example, enter 2000 for a $20 payment. Have your credit card on hand to enter your credit card number, expiration date, and security number. One phone call gives you the power to regain control of your day. Skillec's interactive voice response system. Skillec, powering responses.